In terms of this conflict, um, this ultimately is going to culminate in the War of 1812. This ultimately will culminate in the War of 1812. What we want to see is how do we get there? I'm going to argue that we're already on the road to the War of 1812. We just don't know it yet. We don't sort of know it at this point. Jefferson will leave office in 1809, and you can argue that the table's kind of already set, right? The table's sort of already set in terms of these tensions that will spill over into the War of 1812. The War of 1812 has always struck me as one of these conflicts that kind of gets skipped over a bit. You can understand why, right? The Revolution is before. Obviously, we're interested in the Revolution and its significance. It creates the nation, literally. The Civil War is after, right? It kind of destroys the nation, at least temporarily, and then we got to put the pieces back together again. So in some ways, I feel like the War of 1812 is kind of skipped over. And I don't want to do that. I don't want to actually briefly look at some of the high points of it and the significance. There's going to be some unexpected significance that comes out of this War of 1812, which we can work through kind of quickly, despite the number of terms that you see up there. This period leading up to the war, and then the development of the nation after the war, is going to be really important. And so I think that the war itself is kind of a lens to explore this period. Remember, Jefferson leaves, and his second term is also seen as only fairly successful. Right? He's good domestically for the most part, but in terms of foreign policy, he's going to have some challenges, some will say. And some of these foreign policy issues will impact us here at home, impact him specifically. For example, as conflict between European nations, especially England and France, as that tension bubbles back up, it's going to impact us. It's going to pull us in these different directions. Remember, we have connections with both Britain and France. So every time they're in conflict, it's almost like we're in conflict as well. It seems difficult, if not impossible, in certain moments to maintain neutrality. Yet that's going to be our goal, to maintain neutrality. So as tensions increase between England and France, Jefferson will make a decision, which we will later call the Embargo Act. The Embargo Act. He will make a decision to halt all trade with the warring nations. He wants to halt all trade with the warring nations until they can agree to give safe passage to American ships. So basically what's happening is we have American trading ships sailing to France or to England, but they're getting intercepted, right? They're getting harassed. If we're sailing to Britain, French ships are like, oh no, they're trading with the enemy. Or if we're sailing to France, British ships are like, oh no, they're trading with the enemy. Right? We're like, look, we're just, this is the Amazon delivery, right? It's priority shipping. We got to get there, right? They already paid for it. We're all good. We're not in this. And they're like, yes, you are. How do you maintain neutrality when the other two are at war? Is it possible? So Jefferson's decision is going to be this Embargo Act. We won't trade with either side. Let's not trade with either side. But part of what's interesting about this is how this Embargo Act will be interpreted. How is it going to be interpreted? What I'm going to argue is that you're already seeing some of these rules and regulations and laws being interpreted in terms of sectionalism. You're going to start to see a growing sectionalism. What is sectionalism? We'll talk about it more in the 1830s, 1840s. But basically, the different regions or the different sections of the country have their own identities. And they don't always get along. And in fact, they're going to start to become hostile towards each other. Right? North, South, about the tensions that are developing between North and South. Well, how does sectionalism come into this Embargo Act? Well, think about North and South. Jefferson is from Virginia, right? He's a proponent of the small farmer. The Federalists are more powerful in New England, in the North, where merchants and commercial and trade and shipping and things are more important economically. So this Embargo Act, which is cutting off trade to both Britain and France, will cause tremendous domestic hardship, especially in New England. Right? It hurts the economy, but especially New England's economy, especially the North. Some will argue that Jefferson does it on purpose. Right? Some will argue that Jefferson does it to hurt the Federalists, to hurt the North, and to help the South. Right? So I would argue already we're seeing how these rules are being interpreted based on your regional perspectives. Remember, we've talked about how the colonies start off as different from the very beginning, how the regions feel different from the very beginning. Maybe they're always going to be different. What we're going to ultimately see is that they become so different and so hostile towards each other that war will be possible. Civil war will be possible. Now, maybe you can argue it back this far, maybe you can't, but at least we have a kind of seed planted because it's how people are interpreting it. It doesn't even matter if it's reality or not. It's how folks are already interpreting it. So, so the Embargo Act will widen the gulf between the Federalists, who were strongest in New England, and Jefferson's own party, Democratic Republicans, who are strongest in the South. In addition, it doesn't work. The Embargo Act fails to force England or France to kind of recognize our sovereignty, to respect our neutrality. And relations with England will continue to deteriorate. They get worse. Hostility is increasing during Jefferson's second term. So much so that war is becoming increasingly likely by the time Jefferson leaves. By the time he's out, by the time he hands off the keys to James Madison in 1809, it seems more likely that we're going to have to fight another war. So this period between 1809 and the 1820s or so is often referred to as a period of nationalism, a period of nation building. Because we're trying to build a nation, right? We're trying to demonstrate our sovereignty. We want to prove to everyone, especially the nations of Europe, that we are equal to them, right? That we're no longer a colony. We shouldn't be treated as such. We have to be treated with respect. And if you're not going to respect us, we're going to force you to respect us. But we don't have the muscle quite yet to do it, right? So it's interesting. It's a transition sort of period, this period of nationalism between the 18-teens and the 1820s or 30s. The War of 1812 is going to be one of the events, I think, that kind of catapults us in that direction. Right? So 1809 will be the inauguration of James Madison as president. Andrew Jackson is elected in 1828. So these are the presidents that kind of bookend this period between 1809 and 1828. We'll talk a little bit about Madison and much more about Jackson, who's seen as really, really important. So this is the period of nationalism and nation building. During this period, we will survive a second conflict with Great Britain. Again, American exceptionalism. Once again, we go and fight them. The most dominant power at the time, and we do not get destroyed. Right? We do not get destroyed. So again, further proof, perhaps, that we are destined for some kind of greatness. We're also going to begin more and more to move west, right? To begin to settle the West in larger numbers. Well, what about this War of 1812? Why is it that, in some ways, like I was saying, I feel like it's an overlooked conflict. Why is it significant? So what? Why does it matter? Why do we fight it to begin with? Right, the War of 1812 is, I think, telling on several levels. Remember, Jefferson was unable to kind of satisfactorily maintain our neutrality during England and France's long-term conflict. His successor, the president after him, James Madison, kind of inherits all this tension. Right? So maybe Madison was behind the eight ball walking in. Right? He walks in and they're like, "Look, sir, we need you right away. We're about to go to war." He's like, "Dang, I just got here. Can I get some Starbucks? Sit down for a second." They're like, "No," right? It's already kind of emergency by the time he arrives. We are upset about certain things that the British are doing. The British have continued their policy of seizing American ships, which we're like, how are you going to snatch our ships, right? That's essentially an act of war. And their impressment of American soldiers, which is basically American sailors, basically kidnapping American sailors and making them fight for the British Navy. We're like, you can't do this. This is an act of war. In addition, there's something else the British, we don't like about what the British are supposedly doing. We suspect that the British are instigating Native Americans. Right? We suspect that the British are instigating Native Americans to violently resist American settlers that are moving further and further west. We think the British are kind of being a thorn in our side, right? They want to limit our manifest destiny. They want to limit the growth of the nation. And there may be some truth to this, right? The British actually still had a presence in the West. They still had a couple of forts in the Northwest and troops there, even though they weren't supposed to. Right? The British were still in control of the Oregon Territory. So if we're thinking about the people in the way, quote unquote, of our manifest destiny, that would include a lot of people. British are in the way. Native Americans are in the way. Mexico is in the way. So several folks may have to be addressed if we are truly going to achieve this manifest destiny of reaching the Pacific. So we think that the British are intentionally kind of riling up Native Americans. Right? As white settlers push further and further west in larger numbers, particularly after the Louisiana Purchase, right, that seemed to open up this land, right, this is going to increase. This is going to increase. Now, what I want to do is look at this from the perspective of Native Americans, because Native peoples are going to have some difficult choices, as they always have had some difficult choices. How should they respond to this growing American nation? That's been the choice from the first colony. How should they respond? And the answer to that is they're going to respond differently, depending on the individual group. Sometimes there's disagreements within the same Native group as to how they should respond. Some say let's try to work with the Americans, and maybe we can integrate or assimilate into their society. Some will convert to Christianity. Some will cut their hair and wear Western clothing and go to Native schools, for instance. Others will move out of the way. Like, you know what? They keep moving here. Let's just go west. Let's go further west. All right, let's get out of here. But we seem to catch up to them. They move west, but so do we. Some will say, you know what? We've been moving for a couple of hundred years now. Let's draw a line in the sand right here. Let's not move any further. As soon as those Americans step over this line, we will violently defend ourselves if necessary. Some will make that choice. Others will look inward and say, you know what, let's ignore it. So I think that the Shawnee people are going to be a good example of this. Right? The Shawnee are a good example of how Native peoples might respond. And they're also going to illustrate some of these other themes that we're discussing. So some Native populations will begin to mount more organized resistance. And I think a good example is the Shawnee. One of the Shawnee leaders was a leader named Tenskwatawa. Tenskwatawa. I'm practicing saying his name, so I'm going to say it at least 3 more times. Tenskwatawa. You guys aren't impressed? Tenskwatawa. I got speech impediment, so I'm happy with myself to get that right. Tenskwatawa was a Shawnee leader, better known as the prophet to many. The prophet, he's a religious, spiritual figure. Right? His response was a nonviolent one. Tenskwatawa believed that the Shawnee should try to revitalize Native American culture. They should look inward. Right? They should focus on their traditional religions. They should resist alcohol, and kind of purify themselves, kind of resist Western ways, and that it would work itself out. Right? If they did these things, that the rest would work itself out. It would prevent further encroachments by white settlers. Now, although Tenskwatawa preached a form of nonviolent resistance, his brother, another Native leader, by the name of Tecumseh, did not agree with him. Tecumseh was like, yeah, that doesn't work. Tecumseh advocated the use of force. The use of force. He believed that you had to use force in order to force these folks to respect you and to maintain your lands. So there's even a division within the Shawnee people around this, right? It kind of shows you how complicated this might be. Now, in 1811, the governor of the Indiana Territory, an individual by the name of William Henry Harrison, later a president, right, William Henry Harrison will lead U.S. troops in a battle against the Shawnee. He'll lead U.S. troops in a battle against the Shawnee at a place called Tippecanoe. So Harrison will become known as Old Tippecanoe when he moves into politics, right? He's a war hero after this. Now, although in this battle, more American lives were lost, more American lives were lost than Native American lives, the American nation is bigger, right? So they could afford to lose more people. And so Tecumseh is like, uh-oh, I got to do something. What does Tecumseh decide to do? He will actively seek a British military alliance. He'll actively seek assistance from the British. Now, this decision is going to make the American Congress more hostile towards the British, because what have we been saying? We've been saying that the British are trying to instigate Native Americans, right? And now he's like, hey, we back up. We're like, see? Right? So it becomes this kind of self-fulfilling prophecy in a sense. Now, what it does is it makes the American Congress and the American public a bit more hostile, not just towards the Shawnee, but also towards Britain. We feel like they're an obstacle to our progress, that they're in the way, they're in trouble. They are trouble, I should say. These tensions will increase in the months leading up to the War of 1812. Now, again, I told you the British are in the way, technically, right? They maintained forts in the Northwest, despite the fact that they were not supposed to be there, according to the Treaty of Paris after the Revolution. They also were in control of the Oregon Territory. By 1811, the Congress is increasingly in favor of war with England. And war hawks, as they were known, right, those in favor of war, particularly congressmen that were in favor of war, will appeal to notions of American nationalism, notions of American pride. Many will argue that we have to fight England if we're going to maintain our self-respect. Some will argue that we should look at this as an opportunity to go to war because we can get land out of it. Some are going to argue that we should take Canada. We should whip the British again real quick, take Canada, and add it to the U.S. Think about manifest destiny, right? This notion of maybe we'll spread north as well as west. Right, so this is also an incentive for some. An incentive for some. In June of 1812, President Madison will ask for a formal declaration of war. Now, despite considerable opposition to war within the nation itself, fighting will begin within about a month along the Great Lakes region. Well, who's going to be opposed to the war? Well, many of the Federalists were opposed to the war because if you remember, the Federalists were more closely aligned with the British. It was the anti-Federalists that were more closely aligned with the French. So many of the Federalists are like, look, how are you going to go to war with your number one trade partner? What kind of sense does that make? That's going to hurt the economy, particularly in New England, right? That was a Federalist stronghold where merchants were particularly important. Shipping and trade, right? It's going to be more important there than in the agrarian South. So many of them are like, this doesn't make sense. Right? This doesn't make sense. But as you know, during times of war, right, patriotism, nationalism will be at an all-time high. So this is going to be significant, right? This is going to be significant. Who wins the War of 1812? Who wins the War of 1812? Well, it's kind of a draw. It's kind of a stalemate. How can it be a draw? I'm going to give you a copy of something. How can it be a draw? Well, both sides will claim some victories from this. The Americans want to seize Canada. They're not able to do so, right? They'll be turned back from being able to annex Canada. So Britain takes that as a victory, you might say. Although the British would actually burn down Washington, D.C. So some might say, well, wait a second. That means the British won. You burned down the other nation's capital? That's pretty good, right? But they don't capture the government. Right? The government can flee and regroup. So despite the fact that they burned down D.C. in August of 1814, they're going to be unable to deal that decisive blow to the American forces. We will be resilient. Right? We will survive. After the British left Washington, D.C., they will march northward up Interstate 95. Okay, it didn't exist. But they will go north to Baltimore. Will go north to attack Baltimore, and a fierce battle will ensue around Baltimore. They'll be bombarding the Fort McHenry, I believe, in Baltimore in September of 1814, and they expect to annihilate this fort and take it. They expect to take the city of Baltimore. There is a local doctor, a local physician and poet by the name of Francis Scott Key. A physician and poet who's watching this battle. He's watching the bombardment of the fort, and he will write a poem about what he sees. This poem will later be set to music and will become our national anthem, the Star-Spangled Banner. So think about the lyrics: the rocket's red glare, bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Right? This idea was, when it's being bombed that night, people are like, man, by the morning, it's going to fall. The British flag will be flying over the fort. But in the morning, our flag is still flying. Right? We will hold out. And so despite the fact that it seems like we're taking losses, we don't get defeated, we don't get destroyed. So this is why many people say that the War of 1812 is a draw. And in surviving this, that maybe it fuels our patriotism, right? It fuels our national pride. We know that we can survive a conflict with the greatest military powers on the planet twice because we've done it. So I think it's significant, even though it's not necessarily a victory. It is significant. I mean, it gives us our national anthem, for goodness sakes. I always thought the national anthem came out of the Revolution, but no, it comes out of this sort of early example of nation building in that sense. So I think the War of 1812 is significant. There's two more quick things that happened at the end of the war that are significant as well. The Treaty of Ghent, I think I pronounced that right. The treaty is signed in December of 1814, ending the war. The Treaty of Ghent will be signed in Europe in December of 1814, technically ending the war. Well, okay, the war ends in 1814, great. Well, something else is left undone. Well, the treaty is signed, first of all, leaving all of the issues unresolved. It doesn't really resolve any of the issues that had started the war to begin with. Right? But in addition, because news of the signing of the peace treaty took a few weeks to make it back to the United States. Remember, there is no Twitter, no Instagram. You couldn't text your friends, hey, you signed the treaty, stop shooting. It takes weeks for news to get back. What does that mean? Well, that means that the fighting continues until word makes it back. So, although the treaty is signed in December of 1814, another important battle happens January 8th, 1815. This is going to be the Battle of New Orleans. Battle of New Orleans. In the Battle of New Orleans, the American troops under Andrew Jackson win a decisive victory. Andrew Jackson and his troops will wipe out the British forces at New Orleans. Now, technically it's after the war ends, but it's really important, right? Because we wipe out these troops, it's going to sort of propel Andrew Jackson to national prominence. Right? He's a war hero. And in many ways, maybe it starts him on a path that's going to land him in the White House. He will be a future president from 1829 to 1837. We'll come back to him in a second. So again, although the war ended in a draw, the fact that we had survived, I think, is significant. I think it further proves our feelings of exceptionalism, right? Along with Andrew Jackson's important victory at the Battle of New Orleans, which technically came after the treaty. It's going to be a source of American pride, nationalism, which sort of characterizes this period. Last but not least, the Federalist Party. The Federalist Party makes a decision that's going to kind of be their undoing. Near the end of the war, the Federalists decide to hold a meeting in Hartford, Connecticut. Right? They hold a meeting in Hartford, Connecticut near the end of the war. This is often referred to as the Hartford Convention. Hartford Convention. Now, really, the goals of this were not all that radical. Right? They wanted to meet in order to make some possible amendments to the Constitution. They thought that there were some amendments that should be proposed, particularly to limit presidential powers and to strike a better balance of power between the northern and southern states. Actually, one of the things they wanted to do apparently was to get rid of the Three-Fifths Clause. It's one of the things. Now, again, these aren't, sort of radical things you might think, but because they were meeting during time of war in what seemed like a kind of secret meeting, a lot of folks looked at it as treason, looked at it as them being traitorous. And so the Federalists will never really recover from what was sort of seen as kind of an act of treason, right? If you're meeting during your nation during time of war, right, it seems like you're not necessarily on board with what's going on. And ultimately, the Federalists will decline and kind of fade away from history. They'll eventually be replaced by another party, but they're going to never be as prominent again as they were. With the war over, Americans can now focus their attention on expansion, focus on nation building, focus on domestic issues and such. The demise of the Federalist Party also after the war means that the Democrats are largely unopposed. If they've gotten rid of their political rivals, who's going to vote against them? Imagine right now, 2019, if the Democrats no longer existed. The Republican Party could do whatever it wanted, right? And so this essentially is what's going to happen for a time. We're going to have the Democrats kind of running unopposed in many cases until a new party, the Whig Party, eventually replaces the Federalists. Well, what about these Native peoples? What about these Native peoples and this Native American problem that we've kind of touched on? Right? What is to be done in terms of this quote-unquote Indian problem, as it's phrased during the time? Many Native peoples living east of the Appalachian Mountains are seen as obstacles to progress. Some will argue, as Jackson actually argued, one of Andrew Jackson's nicknames, again, was the Indian Killer, Indian fighter. He had a lot of experience fighting Native peoples in Florida and elsewhere. It was known to be particularly ruthless. He was of the opinion that they might have to be destroyed. Others might say, okay, look, maybe we don't have to destroy them. Maybe we can move them out of the way, place them on reservations, or move them. But most feel like they are obstacles to progress. Many will push for government policies that pushed Native peoples further west, out of the way. Think about this policy of kind of reservationization that is going to be developing in the 19th century. Beginning in 1815 or so, a series of treaties will uproot various Native American societies, culminating in the forced removal of the so-called 5 civilized tribes. The forced removal of the so-called 5 civilized tribes. I kind of think that's significant in and of itself. If these 5, like the Choctaw, Chickasaw, the Seminole, the Creek, the Cherokee, they were seen as civilized, more civilized than other native groups. So if Americans had decided that these civilized folks had to be moved out of the way, you can imagine how they felt about other, quote-unquote, less civilized groups. Right, so there's this idea that there's an Indian problem and they have to be either destroyed or removed. So the Choctaw, Chickasaw, Seminole, Creek, and Cherokee. The Seminole, you may know, are a group in sort of Florida, particularly northern Florida. They actually were a mixture of Native Americans and runaway African slaves. Remember, Florida was controlled by the Spanish, right? And so, let's say Georgia and Florida, that border. What if you have African slaves of the British in Georgia, and you have Spanish-controlled Florida, right? The Spanish, in order to kind of stick it to the British, kind of made it known that, look, you slaves, if you run away, you don't have to run away all the way to the north. If you get across the Florida border, you can be free. So many Africans actually run that way, join with Native peoples, and form the Seminoles. Kind of an interesting history there. We eventually will acquire Florida in part to kind of cut that avenue of escape off. So the Choctaw, Chickasaw, Seminole, Creek, Cherokee, they'll be removed from the Deep South by the 1830s. Indian removal overall will culminate with the forced removal of the Cherokee to the Oklahoma Territory in what's known as the Trail of Tears. They'll be marched to the Oklahoma Territory. Many of them die along the way, which is why we call it the Trail of Tears. Now, in addition to native removal, westward expansion is also going to be facilitated by a revolution in transportation. A revolution in transportation. Well, what's a revolution? What's a transportation revolution? Why do we use that term? Well, I think we use it because revolution essentially just refers to change, right? We often think of revolution as warfare, but revolution often refers to change. So I'm going to just talk about this transportation revolution quickly and then give you a break. Think about the changes that are coming in terms of revolution, in terms of transportation and in terms of communication that are kind of shrinking the country. Even as we're growing, we're shrinking. Even as we're growing, we're shrinking. What does that mean? Well, it's going to be a little easier to travel. Even though we're getting bigger, it might be easier to get from east to west and from north to south because of some of the changes that are happening. What kind of changes in transportation? Well, public and private toll roads will be built in the 1810s and 1820s. Public and private toll roads. So a public toll road might be built by the government. A private toll road might be owned by a private person. So you got to pay a fee, but it's easier to travel, which means you can travel more easily. Now, some of these public and private toll roads would make it easier to connect the frontier to more developed areas. But this is, not the major way people are moving. For the most part, people are using the rivers, right? These navigable rivers, these rivers that can be navigated and traveled are really the major way people are moving in this time. Rivers like the Mississippi, the Ohio, the Missouri, right? And their many tributaries would really be the major forces moving people and goods from the frontier farms to markets back east, and so on and so forth. And with the development of the steamboat, you could actually travel more easily, right? Because you weren't dependent on the currents. You could travel both up and down river once you get the development of the steamboat. Finally, the construction of canals, right? Man-made canals will provide more direct links from eastern cities to the west. These canals are going to be important for the economy and connecting like New York City, for instance, to the west. For example, the Erie Canal. The Erie Canal is used as the kind of quintessential example of this. The Erie Canal is built in 1825. And in 1825, it is a 364-mile waterway. A 364-mile waterway that connects New York City to the Great Lakes. A 364-mile waterway will be built. And think about how that's going to make New York City more important as a kind of financial center for the country. It still is the financial center of the country. So these canals, this transportation revolution is an important one. There is some early industry and early industrialization developing at this point as well, although it's really not until after the Civil War that they'll get a sort of second industrial revolution where most of the industry we think of is going to develop. Industry develops first in England, develops a little bit later here. But we do get some small textile mills, textile factories, for instance, in places like Massachusetts, right, New England. So you'll read about the Lowell textile mills, where southern cotton can be spun into textiles. Right? So we are getting some early industry, which is going to be the model for later, right, later developments. So the nation is growing, right? This expansion is growing. Everything is great. It's kind of like tobacco earlier, right? We have something that's going to fuel the growth of the nation. But, there's always a big but. Part of this expansion perhaps contains the seeds of the destruction of the nation. Wow, you just said all that's great. We got 13 new states, Louisiana Purchase, all of this. Well, every time a new state comes up for statehood, the same question gets raised. Every time, is it going to be a slave state? Is it going to be a free state? That delicate balance between slave and free seems to always have been an issue. Remember, even during the Constitution, we talked about those key compromises around slavery. So this westward expansion will highlight the growing controversy over slavery. Every time you get the proper number of settlers in a new territory, they can apply for statehood. But when they apply, they have to designate, is this going to be a slave or a free state? Now, up through about 1817, North and South had maintained a kind of rough balance, right, between slave states and free states. They essentially would alternately admit a slave state, admit a free state. But Missouri comes up, right? Missouri comes up for statehood. And this is going to challenge the system. When Missouri petitions for admission as a slave state, anti-slavery forces in the North are like, no, can't let that happen. Because they're afraid it's going to tip that delicate balance in favor of slaveholders. So what's going to happen with Missouri? Well, what do politicians often do when they can't come to a conclusion? Compromise. We're going to get a Missouri Compromise of 1820. I think I put that up there, maybe not. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 is going to be crafted. What does it do? It admits Missouri as a slave state. It admits Missouri as a slave state. Well, how did the North let that happen? Well, what we do is we admit Missouri as a slave state, and we cut off a piece of Massachusetts and make it the state of Maine. So they basically make a new state, which is going to be a free state, to balance out the slave state of Missouri. So we maintain that balance in terms of slave and free states. In addition, the Missouri Compromise kind of draws an imaginary line across the country, right, at the southern border of Missouri. Basically, it says that everything south of Missouri is going to be slave territory. Everything north should be free territory. At least a rough kind of line is drawn in 1820. So you get Maine, Missouri, and you also get this kind of imaginary line at Missouri's southern border. Now, what's implicit in this? Well, implicit is the idea that we're going to keep moving west, eventually get to the Pacific Ocean. And so we know that we need a blueprint, so every time these territories come up for statehood, we have a way of figuring it out. Now, as we're going to see, this is not going to solve the problem. In fact, it may make the problem worse. Even though Mexico's in the way in the southwest and Britain's still in the way and Native people's in the way, we know we're going west. So we know that we need some kind of roadmap or blueprint. So does the Missouri Compromise work? Well, temporarily, yes. Right? The Missouri Compromise of 1820 does prevent a major sectional crisis over slavery. But as we're going to see, it fails to create a permanent solution. It fails to create a permanent solution to the issue. To end the period, James Monroe. Right? James Monroe will be president for 8 years, from 1817 to 1825. He's kind of president during an era of relative calm, consensus. We talk about this as an era of consensus. Why is it an era of consensus? Because the Federalists are pretty much gone. So there's no opposition. Right? You can kind of do what you want. Historians refer to this as the era of good feelings. Why were there good feelings? Because there's only one party, basically. So Monroe is important, but he's most known for his Monroe Doctrine. Monroe is going to try to maintain American neutrality in the same way that Washington had laid out. We should be neutral. But he's also going to issue this pretty famous Monroe Doctrine in 1823. And some argue that this changes our foreign policy. This Monroe Doctrine basically declared that the United States would strongly oppose, any European meddling or expansion in the Americas. Right, so we will strongly oppose any European meddling in the Americas. Basically, we're like, look, the Western Hemisphere is ours. Don't mess around here. You stay over there, we'll stay out of your affairs. You stay out of our affairs. But if you do come over here, there might be some problems. So we will steadfastly oppose European meddling or expansion in the Americas, and we will stay out of the affairs in Europe. Now, technically, we don't have the power yet to kind of back this up. We don't have the Navy. We don't have that. But it kind of announces our presence, right? It announces our intentions. Some say it sets the stage for American foreign policy for the next 100 years. Right? Things are going to change, of course, in the 20th century with the world wars and such, as we will see. But perhaps they've already started changing, right? Because we are concerned with events beyond our borders.